The judge mocked her name. The courtroom laughed. But when she spoke one sentence, his career shattered, and the secret she exposed? No one in that room would ever forget it. But first, let's go back to where it all began. The heavy oak doors of the Westport County Courthouse loomed above Samantha Rivers as she paused for a moment on the marble steps, taking a shaky breath. The autumn air was crisp, slicing against her skin as if nature itself was warning her that once she crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. She adjusted the sleeves of her worn-out blazer, a faded navy jacket she had borrowed from her mother, and tried to suppress the trembling in her hands. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, more electric. The anticipation of standing up, perhaps for the first time in her life, for something she truly believed in. Her green eyes, wide and bright beneath the weight of everything ahead, burned not with fear, but with quiet, stubborn resolve. Melissa Rivers stood at her daughter's side, her face etched with a tension that only a mother could know. The desperate, gnawing ache of wishing she could step into the line of fire herself and shield her child from everything cruel and unjust about the world. She squeezed Samantha's hand, a small, firm gesture that said, "You are not alone. You never will be." "Are you ready, honey?" Melissa asked softly. Samantha didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the building, letting her gaze travel across the cold stone, the glass windows, the proud brass plaque that read "Justice for All." She thought about those words, how hollow they had felt ever since Westport Academy had slammed the door in her face. Finally, Samantha nodded. "I have to be." And together they pushed through the heavy doors. The hallway inside smelled like old paper and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Rows of wooden benches lined the corridor, occupied by people hunched over in nervous silence. Lawyers flipping through thick files, parents wringing their hands, defendants staring at their shoes. Life-altering battles would be fought behind each set of double doors, battles that most people outside would never even hear about. Samantha clutched her battered manila folder to her chest, the one containing every piece of evidence she had painstakingly gathered over the past 6 months. Emails, witness statements, documentation of disciplinary actions that seemed to mysteriously disappear whenever questions were asked. At the center of it all, the project that had changed everything. The school had assigned a heritage presentation. Students were encouraged to celebrate their backgrounds. When Samantha proudly prepared a project about her Native American roots, tracing her lineage to the Lakota people, honoring her great-grandmother's survival through brutal assimilation schools, she had expected pride, not punishment. Instead, her presentation was cut short. She was told it was politically charged. A week later, she was called disruptive. A month later, she was expelled. Westport Academy didn't just kick her out. They labeled her a troublemaker, a word that stuck to a teenager's future like tar, and they hadn't counted on her fighting back. "Courtroom 3, Melissa said quietly, checking the board. As they walked, Samantha caught glimpses of lawyers in expensive suits, teachers from Westport Academy whispering together, their glances sharp and full of disdain when they noticed her. She saw Mr. Vaughn, the Academy's lead attorney, speaking animatedly with a group of associates. His Rolex glinted under the harsh lights. He caught sight of Samantha and smiled, not warmly, but with the cold confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. Samantha felt a flicker of something hot in her chest, not fear, anger. The courtroom doors loomed ahead. Melissa paused, smoothing Samantha's hair back from her face. "No matter what happens in there," Melissa said, her voice steady, "you've already won. You stood up when they wanted you to sit down." Samantha swallowed hard. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. A court officer opened the door for them, and they stepped inside. The room was cavernous, colder than Samantha expected, with high ceilings that echoed every sound. Rows of pew-like benches stood empty, except for a few scattered observers and reporters scribbling in notebooks. At the front sat the judge, the Honorable Malcolm Kenton. He was an imposing figure, with a broad chest that strained against his black robes and a shock of silver hair slicked back with meticulous care. His mouth was a hard, thin line until he glanced at Samantha's case file. Then he laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of sound that froze Samantha in her tracks. "Rivers?" Judge Kenton chuckled, raising an eyebrow as he looked over the rim of his glasses. "What are you, swimming upstream today, or are you just playing dress-up for the court?" A few of the Academy's lawyers snickered audibly. Even some of the spectators turned to look, their expressions flickering between amusement and pity. Samantha felt the heat rise to her cheeks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Melissa's hand clamped down hard on Samantha's shoulder, trying to anchor her, but it was Samantha who stood firm. She straightened her spine. She locked her knees, and she said nothing. Kenton leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. "Let's move this along," he drawled, waving a hand. "The court's time is valuable." Not once did he apologize for his remark. Not once did he acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line. Samantha tightened her grip on her folder until the cardboard creaked under her fingers. But still, she said nothing. Because she wasn't here for a fight. She was here for a reckoning. And it was coming. They found their seats at the plaintiff's table, a small wooden desk that looked dwarfed by the grandeur of the judge's bench. The Academy's legal team sat opposite them, sleek, polished, overconfident. The bailiff called the session to order. Court was officially in session. As formalities were read, Samantha scanned the faces around the room. Some were curious. Some were dismissive. A few seemed genuinely sympathetic, but none of them knew what Samantha knew. None of them knew what she was about to reveal. Melissa leaned in, whispering, "Don't let them rattle you." "They already tried," Samantha whispered back. "It didn't work." She took a deep breath, calming the surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. This was just the beginning, and they had no idea how ugly things were about to get. The courtroom was vast and solemn, designed to dwarf anyone who dared to stand before the bench. It smelled of varnished wood, old paper, and the faint bitterness of stale coffee. The ceiling arched high above, where fluorescent lights buzzed softly, making the polished floor gleam like a frozen river. At the far end, Judge Malcolm Kenton presided from an elevated dais framed by the flags of the United States and the state of Connecticut. His black robe, pressed to perfection, hung from his shoulders like a mantle of unquestionable authority. The silver of his hair was so precisely combed back that it looked almost painted on. His heavy-lidded eyes scanned the courtroom with an expression of practiced boredom until they landed on Samantha Rivers. He leaned forward slightly, peering at the case file in front of him, the seal of the court stamped crisply on the cover. A moment passed, then a sharp, barking chuckle escaped his lips, cutting through the hush of the room. "Rivers?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. He leaned back leisurely in his oversized leather chair, clearly amused by his own thoughts. "What are you, some kind of Disney princess, or just pretending to swim upstream in court today?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. At the defense table, the attorneys for Westport's Academy, sleek men and women in $1,000 suits, erupted in laughter. Not polite chuckles, but open, indulgent laughter, as if the courtroom was their private stage and Samantha was merely entertainment. Even some of the spectators, parents waiting for their own hearings, local reporters scribbling in notebooks, a few bored clerks, allowed themselves small, cruel smiles. The sound of it rolled over Samantha in a suffocating wave. She froze where she stood, the manila folder pressed tight against her chest. Her mouth went dry, her heart slammed painfully against her ribs, as if trying to break free. A burning heat crawled up her neck into her face, turning her cheeks crimson. For one split second, she felt the sting of tears. The humiliation was immediate, visceral, like a slap. She caught a glimpse of her mother, Melissa, beside her, saw the stricken look in her mother's wide, horrified eyes. Melissa gasped audibly, the sound too loud, too sharp. Her hand shot out instinctively to shield Samantha, to gather her close like when she was a little girl and had skinned her knees on the playground. But Samantha didn't move. Something inside her, something deeper and harder than she even knew existed, snapped taut. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze back to Judge Kenton, and she smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It wasn't bright or girlish. It was small, controlled. A smile that said, "You have no idea what's coming." She took a small, invisible breath, grounding herself, her body humming with tension not of fear, but of something sharper, resolve. Judge Kenton, seeing the flicker of resistance in her expression, seemed momentarily thrown off. His amusement dimmed slightly, like a fire catching a sudden gust of cold wind. He cleared his throat gruffly, trying to reassert his dominance over the room. "Let's proceed," he barked, his tone regaining its edge. He motioned for the Academy's lawyers to begin. Gerald Vaughn, lead counsel for Westport Academy, rose with the air of a man fully confident that he had already won. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit and flashed a smile toward Judge Kenton, a smile of old alliances, of favors traded behind closed doors. Samantha sat down at the plaintiff's table, clutching the folder in her lap so tightly that her fingers ached. Melissa slid into the seat beside her. "You're doing great," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Just breathe." Samantha nodded minutely, eyes locked forward. The Academy's team launched into their opening statements, a carefully curated narrative, polished until it gleamed like a weapon. According to them, Samantha Rivers was not a proud student expressing her heritage. She was a disruptive influence, a source of division among the student body, a young woman exhibiting signs of rebellious behavior. Samantha listened without outward reaction as Vaughn spoke in calm, polished tones, twisting the truth with surgical precision. She remembered sitting in the principal's office the day they expelled her, remembered the cold, rehearsed words, "This is in the best interest of the school community." She remembered standing alone outside the building, holding her project in trembling hands, as doors, literal and figurative, shut in her face. But she also remembered what her great-grandmother had taught her. The river carves stone not with force, but with persistence. So Samantha sat there, stone still, while the Academy's lawyers painted her as a troublemaker. Because her turn was coming. The laughter still lingered in the courtroom, like a foul odor no one wanted to acknowledge. She glanced up briefly to find Judge Kenton watching her. There was something almost smug in his expression, as if he were already calculating how quickly he could dismiss the case. As if her presence here was an inconvenience, an interruption to the smooth operation of an old boys' network that had run unchallenged for decades. He didn't see her as a threat. He didn't even see her as real. And that, Samantha realized, was his greatest mistake. The Academy's team droned on, laying out their version of events in painstaking detail, each word designed to paint Samantha as unreasonable, ungrateful, untrustworthy. They spoke of her inappropriate conduct, conveniently ignoring the fact that her conduct had consisted entirely of telling the truth about her family's history. Melissa fidgeted beside her, anger and hurt written plainly across her face. But Samantha remained still, waiting. When Vaughn finally finished, he smirked and nodded toward Judge Kenton, confident the damage had been done. The judge gave a slow, patronizing nod. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Very thorough." He turned to Samantha. "Miss Rivers," he said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy, "you may proceed, if you think you can." The courtroom tittered again. Samantha rose slowly to her feet. Her knees didn't buckle. Her voice didn't shake. She placed her manila folder on the table, opened it carefully, and drew out the first exhibit she had prepared. Her hands moved with deliberate calm, the same way a diver breathes deeply before plunging into dark water. The entire room seemed to lean in slightly, curious despite themselves. Samantha's heart thundered in her chest, but she harnessed the fear, forged it into something sharper, cleaner. She lifted her chin, locking eyes with Judge Kenton, and she smiled that same small, quiet smile. "You asked if I'm just pretending," Samantha said softly, but with a clarity that carried across the courtroom. "Let's find out." The Academy's attorneys shifted uneasily in their seats. Melissa sucked in a breath, feeling a surge of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Judge Kenton narrowed his eyes, sensing, too late, that he might have underestimated her. Samantha laid the exhibit on the evidence table, and with a steady hand, she prepared to flip the entire narrative upside down. Judge Kenton tapped his pen impatiently against the armrest of his chair as Vaughn wrapped up his statement. The judge didn't even ask if Samantha wanted to respond immediately. He simply gave her a perfunctory nod, a silent permission that carried the full weight of contempt. Samantha rose slowly from her seat. Her legs felt like they were carved from marble, heavy and deliberate. She picked up her folder, flipped it open, and withdrew a crisp document. Exhibit 12B, the one she had spent countless nights assembling. A list of disciplinary actions at Westport Academy over the past 3 years. On the surface, it was just data. Dates, names, violations, punishments. But Samantha knew better. She had mapped the patterns hidden within. Patterns that told a very different story than the sanitized fairy tale Vaughn had just spun. Patterns that, once exposed, would be impossible to ignore, no matter how much Kenton and his allies wanted to. "Your Honor," Samantha said, her voice steady and clear, "I would like to present evidence related to the Academy's disciplinary practices." Kenton raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You may proceed," he said, sounding bored. "But make it brief." There was another titter of laughter from the Academy's table. Samantha ignored it. She handed the document to the court clerk, who brought it to Judge Kenton. The judge glanced at it, flipping through the first few pages with obvious disinterest. He barely read it. Instead, he sighed, leaned back, and said, "Miss Rivers, unless you have something truly compelling, I suggest you reconsider wasting the court's time." Samantha felt the familiar sting of injustice rise inside her. The old urge to shrink back, to apologize for taking up space. But she crushed it mercilessly. She took a step forward. "With respect, Your Honor," Samantha said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The Academy's case against me rests on the claim that I violated curriculum standards. But if you review the disciplinary records carefully, you'll see a troubling pattern." Kenton gave a lazy wave of his hand, signaling her to continue, though his expression made it clear he didn't expect anything worthwhile. Samantha pressed on. "In the last 3 years, over 98% of disciplinary actions at Westport Academy have been taken against students of minority backgrounds, despite these students making up less than 15% of the student body. A hush fell over the room. Reporters shifted forward in their seats, pens poised. Even Gerald Vaughn's smile faltered slightly. Samantha continued, each word slicing clean and sharp. And not once, has a disciplinary review resulted in the reinstatement of a student of color, despite documented inconsistencies, witness statements, and direct evidence contradicting the charges. She laid another document on the evidence table. A signed statement from 3 former Westport teachers who had quietly resigned, citing systemic bias within the school's administration. Kenton's face tightened. Vaughn scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt were planted. The room was no longer humming with condescension. It was buzzing with something far more dangerous to the Academy's carefully constructed facade: curiosity. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clenched in her lap, hardly daring to breathe. She watched her daughter. This young woman, who had once been a shy, bookish girl, afraid to even raise her hand in class, standing tall in front of a hostile court, dismantling the Academy's lies with precision and grace. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back. This wasn't the moment for emotion. This was Samantha's battlefield now, and Samantha was winning. Judge Kenton cleared his throat. "I will remind the plaintiff," he said stiffly, "that this proceeding is not a referendum on Westport Academy's policies." "Of course not, Your Honor," Samantha replied smoothly. "It's simply an examination of whether Westport Academy applied those policies fairly, and whether I was expelled not because I was disruptive, but because I refused to hide who I am." Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. The Academy's attorneys huddled together, whispering frantically. Vaughn finally stood by, trying to salvage control. "Your Honor," he said, voice strained, "this line of argument is irrelevant to the specific cause of action at hand." Kenton opened his mouth, ready to agree, but Samantha was faster. She stepped closer to the evidence table, laying down one final document, the one she had saved for last, a confidential memo, signed by the Academy's head of discipline, outlining a quiet removal strategy for students who project non-conforming cultural identities. The memo was time-stamped 2 weeks before Samantha's expulsion, and Judge Kenton knew in that instant that it was going to be very, very difficult to bury this. The rising tension in the courtroom became almost physical, thick enough to taste. Everyone knew it, everyone felt it. The coronation had ended. The reckoning had begun, and Samantha Rivers stood at its center, ready for whatever came next. The silence that followed Judge Kenton's dismissive gesture was absolute, almost sacred. Samantha pushed back her chair with a quiet scrape against the polished floor and rose to her full, unimposing height. She wasn't tall, she wasn't dressed in a sharp power suit like the Academy's attorneys. She wasn't cloaked in the invisible armor of money or influence. But when Samantha Rivers opened her mouth, the very air in the courtroom shifted. A low, quiet force vibrated through her voice, a power born not from volume or intimidation, but from something rarer and infinitely stronger: conviction. "Your Honor," she began, her tone steady, her eyes never leaving Kenton's, "I'd like to present Exhibit 12B, a list of all students disciplined at Westport Academy for project violations." She held the document carefully between 2 fingers, offering it like a piece of evidence and a challenge at once. The bailiff moved toward her, but Judge Kenton waved him off impatiently. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his broad chest, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "If this is about your little identity crisis," Kenton said, his voice full of exaggerated pity, "spare us." A few scattered chuckles rose from the Academy's table. The reporters scribbled faster. Melissa, sitting rigidly behind Samantha, pressed her hands together until her knuckles turned white. She knew the moment was delicate, knew that Samantha stood at the edge of a precipice where a single misstep could send everything tumbling down. But Samantha didn't flinch. Her green eyes sharpened, like a blade being honed against stone. "No, sir," she said, her voice slicing clean through the tension. "This isn't about me." She took a single, measured step forward. "This is about your son." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. The Academy's attorneys stiffened in their seats. Even Gerald Vaughn, who had maintained a thin veneer of smugness throughout the morning, paled visibly. Judge Kenton blinked once, slowly. His fingers drummed once on the desk. A soft, involuntary movement, then stilled completely. For a moment, no one dared breathe. "Explain yourself," Kenton said, his voice quieter now. Tighter. Samantha's hands were steady as she placed another document, Exhibit 14-C, onto the evidence table. She didn't rush. Every motion was deliberate, controlled, inevitable. She looked directly into the judge's eyes, not with defiance, but with the calm, terrible clarity of someone who knew the truth and was no longer afraid to speak it. "2 years ago," Samantha began, her voice low but carrying clearly across the marble room, "your son, Thomas Kenton, was found to have plagiarized his senior capstone project at Westport Academy." The courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. Judge Kenton opened his mouth to object, but Samantha pressed forward before he could cut her off. "Multiple witnesses," she continued, "reported the violation. Documentation exists confirming that over 75% of his project was copied from online sources without proper citation." The courtroom shifted, a ripple of shock, outrage, fascination moving through the gathered crowd like wildfire. "And yet," Samantha added, letting the pause hang for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, "not only was Thomas Kenton not disciplined, he was awarded the Westport Scholars Full Ride Award to Eastbridge University." A flash of red bloomed on Judge Kenton's face, starting at the collar and crawling upward like an unstoppable tide. "This is irrelevant," Vaughn sputtered, rising from his chair. Samantha turned to the judge, ignoring Vaughn completely. "Your Honor," she said, every syllable wrapped in iron, "Exhibit 14-C includes internal emails from Westport faculty, obtained through a court-ordered discovery request, showing that disciplinary action against Thomas Kenton was recommended by at least 2 teachers. That action was overridden by the administrative board, after a direct meeting you personally attended." The walls seemed to close in around the judge's bench. He gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white. "I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a circus," he thundered, his voice cracking at the edges. But the damage was done. The reporters were already texting furiously, some even sneaking pictures under the benches. The Academy's attorneys whispered desperately among themselves, faces taut with panic. Vaughn tried again, a trembling hand waving towards the judge. "Your Honor, we request immediate dismissal of these claims." Samantha stepped closer to the bench, unafraid. "I am simply establishing a pattern," she said coolly. "A pattern of selective enforcement. A pattern that suggests disciplinary policies at Westport Academy are applied not based on objective standards, but based on favoritism, privilege, and connections." She let the words hang there, heavy and undeniable. Melissa felt a tear slip down her cheek. not from sadness but from sheer, overwhelming pride. Her daughter, her brave, fierce daughter, was doing something that generations before her had been taught was impossible, speaking truth to power, and being heard. The courtroom, that had been filled with laughter not an hour ago, was now silent, frozen. Judge Kenton struggled to regain his composure. His mouth opened, closed. His hands trembled slightly on the arms of his chair. "This," he said, voice ragged, "is an outrageous attack on this court, on my family." "No, sir," Samantha interrupted softly but firmly. "This is an examination of integrity." She tapped the top of Exhibit 14C lightly with her finger. And in matters of integrity, no one should be above scrutiny, not even the ones who wear the robe. Another ripple of whispers coursed through the room. The court stenographer's hands flew over the keys, capturing every explosive word. Judge Kenton's gavel slammed down hard against the block, the sound like a gunshot in the heavy air. "Order," he bellowed. But order was a fragile thing, and it had already shattered. Samantha returned to her seat without another word. She didn't need to say anything more. The evidence sat heavy on the table. The truth hung even heavier in the room. Judge Kenton sat stiffly for a long moment, staring down at the bench, as if by sheer willpower he could rewind the last 10 minutes. But he couldn't. The courtroom had seen too much. The Academy's attorneys, once so confident, now looked like rats scrambling to find a sinking ship's lifeboat. Even the bailiffs exchanged glances. The press was already buzzing, emails being typed at lightning speed, tweets forming in drafts. It was over. Maybe not officially yet. Maybe not by gavel and decree, but everyone in that room, Judge Kenton included, knew it in their bones. Samantha Rivers had turned the tide, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom froze. It wasn't the stiff formality that had weighed down the early proceedings. No, this was something far denser, almost tangible, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath. Every gaze, every heartbeat, every tiny movement came to a halt, arrested by the force of the revelation that had just shattered the illusion of control Judge Kenton had so carefully maintained. Judge Kenton himself leaned forward in his towering chair, his robe rustling faintly. For the first time since Samantha had entered the room, he didn't look smug. He looked confused. Then, unmistakably, uneasy. The mask cracked. 2 years ago, Samantha continued, her voice ringing out across the stillness, Thomas Kenton, your son, plagiarized an entire senior project. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Every word was a hammer, driving nails into the coffin of Westport Academy's credibility, and, by extension, Judge Kenton's. Holding up a copy of an official disciplinary report, Samantha took a slow step forward, each movement methodical, giving the weight of her words time to sink deep into the listeners' minds. "He received no punishment," she said, her voice steady. "In fact, he was awarded a scholarship." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then, like a fire igniting along dry brush, the whispers began. First one voice in the gallery, then two, then a low, swelling wave of murmurs, as the spectators, reporters, even courthouse staff began to process what they had just heard. Across the room, Gerald Vaughn, who had spent the morning wrapped in polished self-assurance, visibly paled. He leaned sideways toward one of his junior associates, whispering urgently, papers fluttering in his shaking hands. The judge's grip on the armrests of his chair tightened. The color drained from his face, replaced by a blotchy flush creeping up his neck. But Samantha wasn't finished, not by a long shot. She walked steadily forward, her shoes clicking softly against the polished wood floor. At the evidence table, she laid down the disciplinary report with a careful, almost reverent hand. as if placing a sacred artifact for judgment. "And not just any scholarship," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the whispers, forcing the room back into silence. She lifted her chin slightly, projecting her words toward the press benches without ever turning to look at them. "A full-ride scholarship," she said. "That should have gone to another student. A student who, after raising concerns about Thomas Kenton's academic dishonesty, found her own application mysteriously denied." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Melissa Rivers, sitting rigidly behind her daughter, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her heart swelled with both pride and terror. Pride at her daughter's unstoppable courage. Terror at the sheer scale of the system they were now openly challenging. Judge Kenton opened his mouth. No words came out. His face twisted, muscles bunching around his jaw, but nothing formed. No protest, no rebuke, no denial. For the first time in perhaps his entire career, Malcolm Kenton was speechless. Samantha allowed the silence to stretch, to suffocate. Because she knew silence could be as powerful a weapon as any carefully crafted speech. And right now, that silence screamed guilt louder than any verdict. Gerald Vaughn finally broke the paralysis, scrambling to his feet. "Objection," he blurted. "This is irrelevant character assassination." "Overruled," came a voice from behind the bench. But it wasn't Kenton's. It was the courtroom clerk, nervously reminding Vaughn that, until the judge formally responded, the proceedings would not be interrupted. And Kenton, frozen, cornered, could not find the words. The courtroom, sensing blood in the water, surged forward with energy. Reporters whispered frantically into hidden microphones. Courtroom artists sketched furiously. Even the bailiffs shifted uneasily, waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. Samantha withdrew another document, a printout of internal academy emails obtained through her subpoenas. She unfolded it slowly, carefully making sure every set of eyes could see the academy's letterhead emblazoned at the top. "This," she said, her voice unwavering, "is an email exchange between the former director of admissions and the dean of students at Westport Academy." She paused, letting that sink in. In it, they discuss a concern raised by a student, Sophia Hale, regarding plagiarism in the capstone project awarded the full-ride scholarship. The name dropped like a stone into the courtroom's collective consciousness. Sophia Hale. Bright. Talented. A student who had been expected to win that scholarship. A student who had quietly disappeared from the Academy's narrative after raising questions. Samantha's next words were deliberate. "According to this email," she said, "the administration discussed how best to mitigate reputational risk by denying Sophia's appeal and quietly closing her application under a minor technicality." She laid the email down beside the disciplinary report. "And," Samantha added, her tone sharper now, "they made sure the Kenton family was updated on the outcome. In writing." She held up the final piece. A brief but damning note, confirming that Thomas Kenton's scholarship was preserved and that Sophia Hale's challenge had been successfully neutralized. The room erupted. Reporters leapt to their feet. Spectators gasped audibly. Even Vaughn stumbled backward a step, eyes wide. Judge Kenton's hands gripped the sides of his chair so tightly the leather creaked under his fingers. "Miss Rivers," he croaked at last, but his voice cracked, thin and broken. Samantha didn't flinch. She stood, small and unwavering, before a mountain that had just begun to crumble. "You presided over a system," she said, "that destroyed a young woman's future to protect your own reputation." Her words struck like hammer blows. "And you had the audacity," Samantha continued, "to sit there today and laugh at me, to belittle my name, to mock my identity." She took one final step forward, standing directly under the towering judge's bench, fearless. "This is not just about favoritism," she said. "This is about corruption, about betrayal of public trust." Her voice rang out across the courtroom, clear and defiant. "And it ends today." In the gallery, someone began clapping, a slow, uncertain rhythm that quickly grew louder as others joined in. The sound of it built, first hesitant, then swelling into something like a rebellion, a mutiny against the mockery of justice that Judge Kenton represented. Reporters snapped photographs openly now. Cell phones recorded videos despite the official ban. Melissa pressed her hands to her face, tears streaming freely now. Samantha stood alone at the center of the storm she had unleashed, and she didn't waver, not once. Samantha didn't stop. She couldn't. The truth, long buried and weighted down by fear, favoritism, and privilege, surged forward now like a river breaking a dam, unstoppable, roaring, merciless. Her heart pounded fiercely in her chest, but outwardly she was calm, her voice cutting through the thick electric air of the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor," she said, her tone even and unwavering, "records show you personally intervened in the scholarship committee's decision. You pressured them to award your son the full ride despite overwhelming evidence of academic dishonesty." She stepped closer to the evidence table, tapping lightly on the documents she had laid out. Undeniable proof, now glowing like embers in the eyes of the assembled crowd. "And you," she added, pausing just enough to let the words bite, "sealed the investigation into your son's plagiarism, not for the sake of justice, not for the integrity of the institution, but to protect your own reputation." A murmur swept the courtroom like a gust of wind before a storm. A local reporter in the back row, who had spent most of the morning yawning through tedious procedural arguments, scrambled frantically for his notepad, the pen nearly slipping from his hand in his haste. Others followed suit, their faces alight with the unmistakable hunger of a breaking scandal. Camera lenses zoomed in. Fingers danced over smartphone screens. In an instant, the room transformed, from a place of mockery and dismissal into a battlefield where every spectator knew they were witnessing the collapse of a man who once thought himself untouchable. Melissa Rivers sat frozen on the bench, her entire body trembling with the enormity of the moment. She had always known her daughter was strong, but this was something else entirely. Watching Samantha now, standing firm before the judge who had laughed at her, ridiculed her very identity, and tried to erase her voice, it was like watching a star being born, blinding, unstoppable. Tears welled in Melissa's eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Stay strong for her," she willed herself, because Samantha was doing something that mothers dreamed their daughters would one day do, standing against injustice, no matter the cost. And Melissa knew. After today, no one would ever dare silence her again. At the bench, Judge Malcolm Kenton was unraveling. It was not the sudden, explosive kind of collapse. No shouting, no wild accusations, at least not yet. It was slower, more devastating, like watching the foundation of a grand old building crack, shudder, and finally give way. His face darkened, turning an alarming shade of crimson as he struggled to regain control of the room. And himself. "You are out of order," he roared, slamming his gavel against the block with such violence that the wood cracked sharply, the sound splitting the air like a gunshot. The gavel's head broke clean from its handle, tumbling noisily onto the polished floor and rolling away, forgotten. The courtroom collectively flinched. Even Vaughn, usually composed to the point of smugness, recoiled slightly. But Samantha didn't blink. She didn't shrink. She didn't stammer or apologize. as so many before her might have done under the weight of authority crashing down upon them. Instead, she lifted her gaze, clear, piercing, and spoke. "Then, perhaps, sir," she said, her voice calm as a still lake after a storm, "you're not fit to maintain order at all." A single gasp echoed across the gallery. It was the kind of moment people remembered for years, where they were sitting, how the light looked, the taste of adrenaline in the back of their throats. Because in that instant a young woman had turned a courtroom, a symbol of unyielding power, against the very man meant to uphold its dignity. And there was no going back. Judge Kenton shot up from his seat, towering over the courtroom, his robe billowing behind him like a tattered banner. His mouth opened, furious words gathering like a thunderhead behind his teeth, but nothing came out. No ruling. The moment Samantha returned to her seat, the prosecutor's office sprang into action. The lead prosecutor, a wiry man in a navy suit with silver hair at his temples, leaned over and whispered urgently to one of the clerks. Within seconds, a formal motion was filed, requesting an immediate recess. "Motion to recess. Grounds of emergent review," the clerk announced breathlessly. Judge Kenton, still slumped in his chair, still staring hollow-eyed at the shattered gavel on the floor, didn't object. He didn't even blink. The motion was granted without ceremony, and then the courtroom, which had been brimming with barely contained tension, exploded into chaos. Attorneys huddled in frantic circles, voices raised in urgent whispered arguments. Some spoke into phones held tightly to their ears, pacing furiously across the marble floor as if trying to outrun the fallout. Gerald Vaughn, red-faced and sweating through his tailored suit, barked orders at his junior associates who scrambled to gather scattered documents. Reporters abandoned all pretense of decorum, some standing on benches, others dashing toward the exit to be the first to break the story. Breaking. Judge Kenton implicated in scholarship fraud scandal, someone muttered loudly, reading off their phone. The words felt surreal, even hanging heavy in the air like smoke. Court security attempted, half-heartedly, to corral the chaos, but it was like trying to gather a whirlwind with bare hands. Judge Kenton, meanwhile, disappeared wordlessly into his chambers, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a hollow, final-sounding thud. It was like watching the final act of a crumbling empire. And at the heart of it, sitting quietly and calmly amidst the storm, was Samantha Rivers. Outside the courthouse, the story broke within minutes. Local news stations interrupted regular programming to flash breaking headlines across the screen. Push notifications buzzed phones up and down Main Street. Scholarship Gate, Oshkosh, Westport. Cover-up. Justice for Sophia. Hashtags began to sprout like wildfire on social media, spreading from Westport to neighboring towns, then cities farther away. People who had never heard of Samantha Rivers an hour ago were now sharing her story, a teenage girl who stood alone against corruption and won. On the steps of the courthouse, reporters jostled for position, their microphones raised high like weapons in the battle for the next exclusive. But Samantha and Melissa slipped quietly out the side entrance, away from the flashing cameras and shouted questions. They needed a moment, just one, away from the noise, to breathe. They found a weathered wooden bench tucked beside the courthouse garden, shaded by an ancient oak tree whose gnarled branches curled protectively overhead. The world around them buzzed with electricity, sirens blaring in the distance, voices raised in anger and excitement. But here, in this tiny pocket of stillness, they found peace. Samantha sat heavily, the weight of the day finally pressing down on her thin shoulders. Melissa lowered herself beside her, hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she were afraid that if she let go, even for a second, everything would come spilling out. The pride, the fear, the overwhelming relief. For a long moment, they said nothing. They just sat. The sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the pavement in warm gold and deep shadow. Samantha let her head fall back against the bench, her eyes closing briefly against the rush of adrenaline that was finally starting to ebb. And then, "You were brilliant," Melissa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They sank deep into Samantha's heart, warm and heavy and true. For the first time that day, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Samantha allowed herself a real smile. Not a polite smile, not a guarded smile. A real, radiant, bone-deep smile. It lit up her whole face, softening the tight lines of exhaustion around her eyes, bringing color back to her cheeks. It was a smile that said, "I did it. I survived. And maybe, just maybe, I changed something." Melissa reached over and gently brushed a lock of hair from Samantha's forehead, just as she had done when Samantha was small and scared of thunderstorms. "You made them listen," Melissa said softly. "You made them see." Samantha's smile deepened, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the incredible, unbearable relief of being seen, being heard, after so long in the shadows. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. Melissa shook her head, her own eyes glistening. "You did this, Sam. You stood up when no one else would. You stood for Sophia, for every kid who's ever been told they don't belong." Their phones began to buzz insistently, vibrating against the bench. Samantha glanced at her screen. Hundreds, literally hundreds, of messages, notifications, friend requests, news alerts. Her classmates, many of whom had remained silent during her ordeal at Westport Academy, were now posting online, sharing their own stories of favoritism, corruption, and intimidation. Anonymous accounts sprang up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, spilling confessions and screenshots of whispered threats from school administrators. Teachers, too, began to speak. Retired faculty, who had once stayed silent out of fear for their pensions, now offering quiet, damning confirmations. It was as if a dam had broken, the lies and silence that had protected the powerful for so long now washing away in a flood of truth. And at the center of it all was Samantha Rivers, the girl with the funny last name, who had refused to bow her head. Across town, at Westport Academy, the mood was very different. Panicked emails zipped through administrative servers. Students clustered in hallways, whispering urgently. Parents demanded emergency meetings. The Board of Trustees, smelling blood in the water, called a closed-door session to discuss immediate and appropriate actions. And though the Academy would fight, they would fight hard. Samantha knew, deep in her bones, that they had already lost the war, because truth, once set free, was impossible to cage again, and she had set it free. 2 weeks later, the fall was complete. The morning sun rose sluggishly over Westport, casting long, slanted beams of gold across empty streets still littered with yesterday's headlines. Judge Malcolm Kenton resigns amid scandal. Judicial titan brought down by brave teen. Scholarship fraud. Rocks elite academy. It was everywhere. No one, not even the most loyal sycophants, could pretend they hadn't seen it coming. Judge Malcolm Kenton's resignation was announced with no press conference, no final speech from the bench, no grandiose gestures. Just a dry, carefully worded letter released through his attorney's office, printed in newspapers with all the ceremony of a funeral notice. After careful consideration, and in the best interest of the judicial system I have served for over 3 decades, I hereby tender my resignation. I maintain my innocence and deny any intentional wrongdoing, but recognize that ongoing proceedings would serve only to distract from the important work of our courts. It was pathetic, it was hollow, and it fooled no one. The public saw it for what it was, an admission of guilt wrapped in the brittle language of pride. Talk shows dissected every sentence, every comma. Editorials tore into him with gleeful fury. And the Bar Association? They weren't finished. Within days of his resignation, formal proceedings to disbar Malcolm Kenton began, a process that promised to strip him not just of his title, but of his legacy. The man who had once held entire lives in his hands would likely spend the rest of his days in quiet disgrace, his name a byword for corruption in the state's legal history books. Westport Academy, once untouchable behind its ivy-covered walls and gleaming brochures, was next. Under mounting pressure from parents, donors, and regulators, the academy fired its headmaster, a man who had for years quietly facilitated the favoritism and cover-ups behind closed doors. Several senior staff members followed him out the door, each resignation phrased in the same carefully sanitized language. We wish to spend more time with our families. We are pursuing new opportunities elsewhere. We stand by our commitment to excellence. But no amount of polished spin could hide the truth anymore. The institution that had once branded itself a beacon of opportunity now stood exposed as a shrine to nepotism, privilege, and exclusion. Enrollment applications plummeted. Scholarship offers dried up. Parents pulled their children mid-semester, citing a fundamental breach of trust. And then, the class action lawsuit was filed. Dozens of former students, some who had suffered quietly for years, joined together in a legal action against Westport Academy, alleging wrongful expulsions, discriminatory practices, and emotional damages. The media dubbed it the Westport Reckoning. Lawyers estimated the potential damages in the tens of millions. The Academy's pristine legacy lay in ruins, shattered not by rival schools or government intervention, but by a single, determined voice that refused to be silenced. And that voice? It belonged to Samantha Rivers. Her name spread far beyond the sleepy confines of Westport. At first, it was a trickle. Local papers, regional talk shows, then a wave, national broadcasts, morning television interviews, glossy magazine profiles. But Samantha wasn't chasing fame. She didn't posture. She didn't spin her story for likes or retweets. Every time a journalist stuck a microphone in her face, she said the same thing. This isn't about me. It's about truth. It's about every kid who was told they weren't enough. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. The world listened, and it responded. She was invited to speak at youth advocacy conferences where high school students rose to their feet in thunderous applause. She sat on panels at civil rights organizations, her voice unwavering among seasoned activists and seasoned politicians. She was no longer the girl with the funny last name, the name that had once drawn ridicule and dismissive jokes from the powerful. She was the girl who had dared to stand up, and who had won. Her story was taught in ethics classes, referenced in leadership seminars, quoted in TED Talks about courage and change. Parents whispered her name to their children with awe. Look what she did. Look what's possible when you refuse to back down. Her bravery didn't just inspire, it ignited. Students at other schools began to organize their own campaigns against unfair disciplinary practices. State legislators quietly floated bills to strengthen protections for whistleblowers in education. Judicial reform panels cited her case as a catalyst for necessary oversight reforms. The ripples of Samantha's stand spread outward, touching lives she would never meet, changing futures she would never see. But for Samantha, the victory wasn't about public acclaim or legislative milestones. It was about something quieter, something more personal. It was about sitting on that old bench outside the courthouse and feeling, for the first time, that she was seen. It was about walking into a room and knowing that her voice mattered, that her truth had weight, that her name, rivers, was not something to be mocked or minimized, but something to be proud of. A river carves through stone, not with violence, but with persistence. And Samantha Rivers had carved her way through the granite walls of corruption and arrogance with nothing but determination, truth, and the refusal to bow. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of interviews and meetings, Samantha and Melissa sat together on the back porch of their home. The cicadas hummed in the thick summer air. The stars, distant and ancient, blinked overhead. For a long time they said nothing, simply breathing in the quiet, the peace that had been so hard-won. Finally, Melissa turned to her daughter. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked softly. Samantha smiled, a small knowing smile. "I realized something," she said. Melissa waited. Samantha leaned back, looking up at the endless sky. "I realized," she said, "that sometimes the world only changes because one person refuses to sit down when they're told to." Melissa blinked back tears and reached out, taking Samantha's hand in hers. And in that moment, in the hush between heartbeats, between stars and porch lights and distant, sleeping towns, a new truth settled into place. Samantha Rivers hadn't just fought for herself. She had changed the world, even if just a little. And sometimes, a little was all it took to start a revolution. Months later, Samantha stood before a new judge, one who treated her and her mother with dignity. The court ruled in their favor, a full exoneration of Samantha's record, financial restitution for the damage caused, and a formal apology from Westport Academy. Outside the courthouse, Samantha faced a sea of reporters. But instead of grandstanding, she simply said, "I wasn't fighting just for me. I was fighting for every kid who was ever told their voice didn't matter. And today, we proved them wrong." The crowd erupted in applause. Melissa wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and for the first time in a very long time, Samantha Rivers walked away smiling, her head held high.